This is Interpreting Wine host and founder Lawrence Francis, welcoming you to this, my Willamette Valley Winemaker Special. Across these 20 episodes recorded in quickfire fashion in January 2020, I got to meet a broad selection of people making wine in the region, both a variety of winemaking scale from the micro to the macro, and also different focuses that include different aging vessels, different grape varieties, sparkling wines, and of course different interpretations of Pinot. Episodes are going to be released in the order that they were recorded, so you'll get to be a virtual guest on the tour. 2 things you can do to help spread this series even further. One is to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already, either where you're listening or on your favorite podcast platform. And the second, the one that's really going to help push this out there, is to head to interpretingwine.com/iTunes and leave a review letting me know what you think. A genuine, huge thank you in advance. Today's episode of the Willamette Valley Winemaker Special features Scott Shull of Raptor Ridge Winery. In what is a true educational masterclass, we hear Scott's origin story and transition into the winemaking world. He gives us a detailed orientation to Raptor Ridge and the wider region, before leading us through a tasting of 3 whites and 2 reds, and finishes by looking ahead to Pinot Camp 2020. Enjoy.
Raptor Ridge, it makes about 10,000 cases of wine a year here in the Willamette Valley. I called myself wine grower because it is not only the making of the wine, but it's the producing of the fruit and growing it in a way that makes high quality wine, but also a high quality environment. More on that later. How did I get into this? This is basically a hobby that got way out of control. It's not my first career. I came to Oregon, gosh, what is it now? Almost 40 years ago. And I was recruited here by a little startup that was burgeoning out of Silicon Valley, and they wanted to have another beachhead up here in Oregon, a company called Intel, and the rest is history. They've grown to where everybody knows about Intel inside. But as I looked around in this beautiful environment and saw these crazy row crops that people were putting in, I started asking questions of my neighbors. Hey, what are you growing? I come from historically a farming background. My grandparents were homesteaders in Kansas, right in the middle of the United States. So even though I was involved in high tech, I liked getting my hands dirty. And so over the past 25 years, I've learned to graft vines, lay out vineyards with a surveyor's sextant, really very hands-on. All of us are here at Raptor Ridge. We do a lot of things that are, you might say, vertically integrated, from grafting your own vines all the way through, every step of the winemaking process. I still am driving the tractor on a daily basis, doing the ground cover management, the spraying, etc. I love it, but it's also a way to be deeply involved with every aspect of growing wine.
It's always something that I'm curious to know when I hear such a leap, I guess you'd say, such a change, from Intel, and we were talking before, traveling in Europe and being kind of over here and potentially, kind of Oregon versus Kansas. So I wonder if could you just fill in a little bit of that, because I'm curious to know, and I'm sure the listener would like to know also.
It wasn't a step function. It started with a group of us who thought we might like wine, and we weren't quite sure what kind, but we wanted something good. And so we formed a wine tasting group. Once a month, get together, buy a bottle of wine communally that no one of us could afford alone, and have somebody do a little research and make a presentation. Great, your month is next. So every month a different wine, starting, of course, we get attracted by these big, bold Chardonnay du Pape from the Rhone, or a vineyard-designated Zinfandels coming out of California. But slowly our palates evolved to where the the thing that was most interesting was this grape coming out of Burgundy, and it's called Pinot Noir. I mentioned earlier about these row crops that were getting planted 40 years ago here. Much of it was Pinot Noir and Riesling and Pinot Gris, but Pinot Noir was the mainstay of the Oregon wine industry, still is. So I started cutting my teeth on tasting Pinots from around the area here. Fell in love with an Elk Cove 1987 that I recently had a chance to taste with the Campbell family. Adam Campbell, I think, is on your visit list. So it was captivated me. How can a wine be, almost transparent and light in color, but still have heft and weight and flavor and complexity? Something that almost asks you more questions than it gives you answers. So I always am very curious. So I started pursuing Pinot, and in this same tasting group, there was a gentleman who I was brewing beer with. We had some background in how to ferment things. And in the brewer's shop where we got our supplies, there was a note card that said, wine grapes for sale for home winemakers. Bing! Hey, we can do this. So Peter Gibson and I started fermenting all kinds of things and experimenting. And I just really got bit badly by the bug, as they say. Started buying every book I could on fermentation, viticulture. UC Davis, which is one of our nation's top schools for viticulture and enology, started offering these 3-day programs, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, targeting people who had day jobs, usually day jobs in the wine industry. So I would fly down and immerse myself in that. And what was the wine writer from Canada that I spoke with came up with a fancy term for me. He called me an autodidact. Yeah. It sounded like an insult, but it just means self-taught. So basically self-taught, and learning and doing and experimenting. And it's been, a lot of hard work, sometimes some heartbreak, some major successes, but it's really become a privilege to be able to live a life this way. As I said, it wasn't a step function of, one day quit your day job. I, with my wife, Annie, her help and others, I basically was working 2 full-time jobs for 20 years. I retired from high tech 5 years ago in 2015, but all the way from 1980 to 2015, it was holding down a full-time job in a company that has high expectations for excellence, and then on the evenings and weekends doing this and saving up all my vacation time for harvest usually. But what a long, strange trip it's been.
Yeah. Thank you so much, because I did have that inkling that there was a lot more that maybe you were sort of too modest to share, or just I think it really is, it's quite humbling to hear that story, because it's not easy, I'm sure, just working at Intel and doing that job really well, but to have all of the other stresses and strains here, and then saving up your vacation to do 18-hour days and to really go to town in harvest. I mean that really I think that says a lot. So thank you for sharing that. Being as we are here, January 2020, stood in your lovely tasting room with a whole sort of two-sided glass, with lovely vistas out onto your property. I think it would help me, and I think would help the listener, for you just to explain what we're looking at here, and kind of I guess again put it into context of maybe potentially the wider Willamette Valley, or what we can see. Just give us your view of the view from the tasting room.
Yeah, maybe I can do that from the large to the small. So you're in the northernmost portion of Oregon, second down from the left, as we say, on the Pacific Ocean, and the Willamette Valley is this bowl of land that straddles the Willamette River from Portland to our north, for about 100 miles south to Eugene, one of our major college towns, and only about 40 miles wide. It's protected from the continental interior, which would be, super freezing right now in snowstorms. But that's blocked from coming into the valley from 10,000-foot mountain peaks, the Cascade Mountain Range, to the east. To the west is the Pacific Ocean, about 60 miles from here. And it's what keeps this a temperate climate, never too hot, never too cold, just right, just like Goldilocks liked it. And we're blocked from the wetness of the Pacific by about a 3,000-foot coast range, the coast range. So the Willamette Valley is what those pioneers, the early United States pioneers, came west because the valley floor is so fertile and gentle rains. It's wonderful for growing fruits and nuts and grasses and berries. But the wine industry evolved, and still principally is up on the hills, up off the valley floor, where the soil is perhaps a little poorer. You don't want vines to be growing vegetatively. You want them to be balanced. So those soils that nobody wanted to farm, at most they put hazelnut trees on them or something that you could just plant and ignore. Those have become some of the prime growing areas of the Willamette Valley. As I said, we're in the northernmost region. Over the last 12 years, the Willamette Valley has started adding more specificity to subregions, so-called American viticultural areas, AVAs. And the Chehalem Mountains, where we stand now, is the northernmost. And it's really a diverse area. It's not one simple soil type that unites the whole thing. There are regions within the Chehalem Mountains that are just that. In fact, coming a little closer to home, you're standing in what the soil geologists call Laurelwood Soil, and it's a newly proposed AVA. We believe soon to be approved within the next year. Mm-hmm. And this Laurelwood soil is loess on top of volcanic soil. So loess is rock flour, granite rock tumbled to where it becomes like talcum powder that can blow in with the wind and land, much like snowdrifts do, onto an opposing face. And that's exactly what happened here when we're looking at these northern stretches of the Chehalem Mountains. These faces were looking back toward the Columbia River to the east and northeast, and it's thought that 15,000 years ago to 25,000 years ago, there were these series of cataclysmic floods that tumbled the granite rock of present-day Montana into that rock flour and washed and blew it on top of ancient volcanoes. So if you dig down 2 or 3 feet, you'll get to that red Jory soil, and you'll be seeing some of that when you visit the Dundee Hills. But on top of that is this loess, and it makes for kind of a hybrid soil type, a little bit sedimentary, a little bit volcanic. What does that mean for wine? Well, one of the things that we love to do at Raptor Ridge is we have vineyard contracts where we lease vineyards in almost all of these other sub-AVAs, as well as growing our own fruit here. And so we have bottlings that give you a tour of the entire Willamette Valley if you just come to one place. We've got our estate, Pinot Noir, grown on that loess soil. I think that gives you wines that are almost like Italian plum, stone fruit, certainly darker red cherry in nuance, and a pronounced ripe tannin load. So it's structured wines with those flavors that I suggested. Silky, almost sappy in its palate, as opposed to, I lease vineyards in the McMinnville AVA, and those are totally on volcanic soils usually. In fact, the site we lease is an old lava flow that's decomposed into this soil that creates inky, dark fruit, blackberry structured. It's almost Pinot masquerading as Syrah, the opposite end of the spectrum. and everything in between. So you asked about Raptor Ridge. This site is a 27-acre property. We are tilting, as you can see, this gentle slope, uniform, from about 500 feet elevation down to 250 feet that you see at the tree line at the bottom. And we're looking east by southeast, watching the morning sunrise, much like the vineyards of Burgundy. So the vineyard warms up and dries out quickly in the morning, helps avoid frost. But in the afternoons, the sun is kind of angled away from us, heading back over that orchard that you see, the hazelnut orchard. And so we avoid the heat units, the heat spikes that happen in the late afternoon that can burn fruit. So I think it's an ideal site, rather than facing strictly to the south. I love this eastern exposure. As I mentioned in kind of my getting to know you remarks, the vineyard was laid out and planted by myself and some dedicated helpers, different teams throughout the years that I came to know. The oldest block is now 20 years old that we planted. I got cuttings of the budwood from vineyards that I had been working with, and then rootstock that's resistant to phylloxera and other diseases that occur in the soil. And we grafted those, grew them up one winter in the greenhouse, and then planted them in the spring. I wasn't able to afford to plant the whole vineyard at once, so I planted the first third, brought it online, sold a little wine, took the money, planted the next third. So over the decade of the 2000s, this now about 20 acres got planted out. Diverse clones of Pinot Noir on different rootstocks that have different vigor. As you go down the hill and the soil is a little deeper and maybe catches more water as it drains, I wanted a devigorating rootstock. The idea is the vineyard is all in balance. One notable thing, there's about an acre and a half at the bottom of the vineyard to the southeast that's Gruner Veltliner, an Austrian varietal. So it's not all Pinot here. We're having a lot of fun with that racy, bracing, fresh Austrian white wine. Why Gruner? The low soils that I talked about are very similar to the low soils of Austria. So almost as a lark, and I took a flyer on it. Yeah. Let's try some Gruner, and it ended up being one of the most successful wines we make. We only make about 500 cases a year, and it's sold out by the time I need to make the next vintage.
So much there that I could speak to, and I think maybe, I think the wines will really tell us that. But actually, as I heard you talking there, it did take me back. Last year I did go to Wagram and did see their lost soils, and so obviously, making the connection here, the wine world seems to just get smaller and smaller. I never thought that I would be coming to the Willamette Valley talking about loss, talking about Gruner Veltliner, and and I think already, only being my second day here, already have seen some of those varieties of Pinot. I think I've tried 5 to date, and they've all been completely different. Obviously, certain philosophies and approaches to the winemaking, but I think in every instance there's been some of the soil, some of the exposition, and some of the clonal variety as well has really been coming through, and diversity expressed in the glass. That's really what I've been seeing so far with those Pinots. So having seen and having heard you talk to the region and the terroir and the site, I think the natural place to go now is into the glass, and to hear you talk about how does all of that turn up in the glass, and I guess as well also now with some reference to winemaking and telling us your philosophy in relation to each of these wines that you put forward.
Indeed. So I mentioned the Gruner Veltliner earlier. It's become one of my darlings of the children that we're raising here. In your glass now is 2018 Gruner Veltliner from our estate vineyard here in the Chehalem Mountains. And that low soil is really having its shape and form imprinted on this wine. Now that the vines are, planted them in '06, so we've got a dozen years. The vines are starting to mature and really showcase this site. It's zippy, fresh. I don't want to say acidic. It's got definitely an edge to it, but it's really just more focused on that citrus spectrum of maybe Meyer lemon and hint of tangerine. But the minerality and as the vines age, that pepper. I don't quite yet get the white pepper that you can from some Austrian, but there's definitely some kind of a cracked pepper in there. This wine is bone dry. When you taste it, you may sense a bit of fruit. There's no residual sugar whatsoever. It's virtually all fermented in cold stainless steel, trying to keep that freshness. Doesn't go into mallow at all, so keeping all that acidity present. A little bit of lees stirring, however. We do maybe 4 barrels in old neutral French oak that we stir the lees and then experiment in the blend back. So it's got a touch of that component in it. Yeah. You'll notice underneath where it says our estate, it's got this crazy name of our vineyard. The Raptor Ridge Estate Vineyard is named Tuscawalami Vineyard, which is out of the language of the first peoples here. It means the place where the owls dwell. And owls are raptors. We build habitat here, hunting perches and nesting boxes down in the forest for owls that were here naturally. We also release owls from the Audubon Society to help us with managing rodents that might get in the way of somebody's ankle, tunneling under the vines. So it's all part of kind of a sustainability approach that we have in how we farm.
I must admit, I didn't expect to be talking again about Gruner Veltliner when I came here. And interestingly, for somebody that maybe hasn't tried this particular Gruner Veltliner, I mean, because of what we now know about the geography, I am noticing elements of this taking me back to the Wagram region. There is the sort of the texture, a lot of people that talk about the creaminess, which isn't necessarily something that you'd always associate with Gruner Veltliner, but I think it's a wonderful grape. Actually, as a terroir expressor, actually showing you and giving you that different look. But I think what I'm really liking here as well is that on the finish, there is, it feels like, some more of that kind of, maybe the volcanic, or there's other minerals. I mean, it's not just sort of playing one note, as it were. There are other components coming through on the finish there.
In your glass now is our Chardonnay. We only make one Chardonnay. It's a vineyard that I lease, and I've worked with through, as I say, all 3 owners throughout its history. It was planted maybe 15 years ago with money that came out of the California Public Employee Retirement Union called CalPERS. Bought up a bunch of Oregon land, planted vineyards, thinking they'd get rich. Didn't quite work out. They sold it to an intermediary, and I continued to lease this from that vineyard management company, who spared no expense in polishing it up and keeping it very well managed, and recently sold it to Jackson Family Wines of Kendall Jackson fame. This is Gran Moraine Vineyard, and there is an eponymous winery name now owned by Jackson family, Gran Moraine Winery. It's out in the Yamhill Carlton region in the foothills between us and the Oregon coast. This is ancient seafloor. It's all sandstone that's been uplifted Very poor soil, very well drained, and it tends to just focus fruit. I love not only what it does with Pinot Noir, but as I said, we've worked with this site now for a dozen years. It's a single Dijon clone of Chardonnay. I think one of the important things that's happened in Oregon recent history, meaning the last 20 years, is we've been able to get the right kind of clonal material imported from the correct regions of the world, in this case from the University of Burgundy, Dijon. And the vineyards are getting some age to them now. So we have the right clone that ripens in our cooler climate. And I think, several of the French wine companies have come here, bought land, and they're generous with their knowledge. And so the sharing of the clonal material and the knowledge about how to approach world-class Chardonnay is really showing in recent years in what you're seeing coming out of Oregon Chardonnay. I don't know your thoughts. It's much more like a white Burgundy, I think, but it's its own thing, Oregon Chardonnay.
Yeah. Thank you. No, that's absolutely gorgeous. I think a wine like this, it really just reinforces and makes one think about the decisions that you have as a winemaker. I mean, because it's showing up in the glass as there's so much complexity. There's the fruit there. There's a drinkability to this as well. And 2016. It feels like this could very well age beautifully over time. And then I see that you've got it under a screw cap, and I wonder and over. I guess it asks another questions, as you have realizations and you ask more questions. I mean, how do these wines perform over time under screw cap? Because I guess the wider perception out there is that if you're going to age a Chardonnay, it should be under cork. So, what are your thoughts and experience on that?
Yeah. Gosh, it's been since 2008 that we've converted our entire lineup to screw cap. So we're seeing how they age. Back in that time frame, the screw caps were hermetically sealed. They're so-called Serratin, where it let no oxygen into the wines, and so the wines, especially white wines, would age quite nicely, but slowly. The red wines, I think the criticism people had about screw caps is they need a little oxygen to help mature those tannins. In recent times, it must be the last 5 years, there's been a technology that allows the winemaker to choose a gas-permeable membrane that they put in the screw cap. And so for some of our wines, like the Gruner, I'll still bottle it with Serratin, no oxygen whatsoever, just maintaining that austerity and that freshness. But with the Chardonnay and the Pinot Noir, I'll put a membrane in there that breathes much like a high-end cork. So it will age that way, but more importantly, it'll age consistently, bottle to bottle. It won't have the variability that you get from a natural product like cork, and it certainly won't have TCA. It won't have the trichloroanisole cork taint. So I think I was heartbroken when I would put my heart and soul into making our most expensive wine for $50, $60, $70, and somebody would pull a cork and it'd be tainted, or worse yet, slightly, and they wouldn't know the quality that went into it. Since we've switched to screw caps, I did a calculation last year or something. I've made like 1.8 million bottles of wine, and I've had 3 failures, 3 bottles reported as failed to me. And it wasn't because of the screw cap. When I had it returned to me, it was a nick in the glass that allowed air in. So I'm convinced that it's the right quality approach. I really think that in the wine world, particularly with the sommeliers that I speak with, the screw cap is not an issue with them. It's more of perhaps someone who is still coming from a historical perspective and doesn't have this information.
I've repeated this now many times, and it may be urban myth. It may be something that one of the listeners can tell you. But I heard of a Californian winery who was bottling both under cork and under cap, screw cap, in the same way that you are, and they actually charged more for the wine that was bottled under screw cap. And it was it wasn't massive. It was call it 80 versus 85. There was I believe they were making the same statement that it's not any lesser quality. And actually, what I remember the argument that they were giving was that it was actually you were getting a wine that was truer to what the winemaker actually wanted to make with that wine, because they could be more sure of how it was going to evolve and didn't need to, say, add sulfur, and there wasn't a sort of taking more of the unknowns out of the equation. Yeah.
You make a very good point with the screw cap. We're also we've always been mindful about our use of sulfite, but with the screw cap, we're able to perhaps use less sulfite in the bottling. And that's a whole long subject unto itself about oxygen management and pickup, etc. But we're convinced that it's the right closure for us. Mm-hmm. Just after the Chardonnay, I poured you a glass of our Auxerrois, Auxerrois. Mm-hmm. I gather the grape came from originally the town of Auxerrois in northern Burgundy, but you find it planted predominantly in Alsace. And I love Alsatian white wines. So as I studied what went into the bottlings, what was its cépage, especially for some of these Grand Cru vineyards, you find that, it's Pinot Gris, but in that vineyard were selection Marcel of Auxerrois and Riesling, etc. So it's a very interesting cépage. There was an experimental planning that Oregon State University did on private land in the mid-Willamette Valley. These vines were part of that experiment, and when they came on the market here about 4 years ago to lease, I snatched it up, and then another half of the vineyard opened up, and we've got that now too. So we're making about 400 cases a year of 100% Auxerrois, barrel fermented in completely neutral French oak, with no mallow at all. So we're maintaining that freshness and that acidity. And as I mentioned, it's a little bit unfair comparison because the Chardonnay that you had is 2016, whereas this is just released 2018. Mm-hmm. So it's got some time to develop those tertiary bottle aromas. But the other thing about Auxerrois is it's genetically a sibling of Chardonnay. They both descended from the same plant material. And so it's kind of fun having those two things together in our lineup. It's become one of my favorite wines. At the end of the day, like, is there a bottle that they're going to throw out because it's been opened today in the tasting room? And I need to take that home. Great with fish or shellfish or something like that.
Yeah, it's again, loving the descriptions, and I think it's one of those wines that I think every winemaker needs in their armor and in their fridge, but I think as well just for the consumer, for myself, for people just wanting to have a wine that isn't necessarily challenging, isn't necessarily overly complex, but it's got that the sort of call, it's got the presence, I would say. It really does stand out. That freshness, that acidity does really get your attention, but it's not austere. It's not sort of you get a lot of wines that are not necessarily fun to drink, that haven't done the mallow and are young and are overly crisp. This is a pleasure to drink, and I guess it's found its spot in your drinking lineup there, where maybe at the end of a day, maybe in the summer, maybe with something light, this is gonna really kind of do the job.
In your glass now is our entry-level Pinot Noir. We call it Barrel Select. It's intended to be a taste of the Willamette Valley in the glass. So we farm around 14 different vineyards all over the Willamette Valley. Many of them have different blocks. The blocks are usually a unique clone of Pinot. And we harvest block by block in each vineyard, bring it here to the winery, including our own estate vineyard, ferment them separately, barrel age them separately, and I end up with, order of magnitude 400 different barrels that Shannon Gustafson and I, Shannon's the winemaker here at Raptor Ridge and a fantastic control freak and wonderful winemaker. Shannon and I will taste through those barrels several times through the year and get an idea of a theory of where they should go in our program. Is it vineyard designate? Is it speaking to a particular place? Or is it a great wine, but it's a component of something larger? And we'll play with the Barrel Select blend to create that consistent representation of the Willamette Valley year after year. And so that is what we mean by Barrel Select. We're selecting those barrels from, I think this particular bottling, the 2017, is 9 different vineyards and 14 different clones of Pinot Noir. And the 17 vintage is quite unique compared to the other recent kind of super hot, definitely dry vintages that we've been having. It was warm and dry, but it presented itself in later in the year. The heat unit accumulation went more into the fall. And so I think the wines are brighter and lean more to the red fruit spectrum and more naturally occurring acidity. A beautiful vintage, high quality vintage here in Oregon. But the wines are much brighter and more focused than, some of these crowd-pleasing monsters that have come from the 2014, 15, 16, and leading us up to what's in your glass now.
Wow, yeah, and I'll just respond straight away, and I think this is gorgeous, and I think we'll maybe include links, and I'll talk about price, but I think that to have something like this in your arsenal as a winemaker here is a it's like an unfair advantage. It's a weapon in the arsenal because it's coming in at a very accessible price point. It's all the things that you've just said there. I think it's super accessible. I think you'll of course you can't make wine for everybody, so there still will be people who it's not sweet enough or it's not big enough. But I think not potentially for the total newbies, but for people who know their way around a glass of Pinot. But equally, there's more depth there in it, and I think it's again back to all of those decisions that you make as winemakers. It was really interesting getting that insight into those conversations, and for what it's worth, I think you've nailed it there, because this is great price point, accessible. And could go into many different components, potentially sort of a by the glass, or it's a real the best kind of crowd pleaser, because it actually would, I think, please people who have, as I say, are looking for something with a bit of depth as well, and with a sense of place. So really like this one.
We're now tasting 2015 vintage from our estate vineyard. You'll recall Tuscaloosa. Oh, it just says Estate Chehalem Mountains. I don't think we started putting the Tuscaloosa on it until subsequent vintages. But 2015, the intention of the estate vineyard is to give the best taste of this site and limit it to 500 cases per year. Mm-hmm. So it's a 500 case bottling. Quintessential Chehalem Mountains. If you remember our earlier conversation, the Pinots really are almost a little sappy and heavy in their weight. They have ample tannins, but the tannins, they're not sharp or bitter at all. They're almost melted, is a term I've heard one wine writer use, and I like that term a lot. almost like baker's chocolate in the background. In the foreground, Pinot presents itself with like Italian plum, that kind of a stone fruit, more than classic red cherry or in some other regions of the Willamette that you'll taste. Those wines will present, red cherry or blackberry or blueberry. Here you're more back into the plum or maybe a dark red cherry along in that sappiness and focused and held together with that those melted tannins. I'm loving the aromatics on this today. We just opened this, and I think it definitely, when the bottle has more time to get air, this will just jump from the glass. But already it's kind of speaking to me.
Yeah, agreed.
That and the aromatics are starting to develop that walk through the forest, as if I can be a little romantic and poetic there. That forest floor, the cedar boughs that have emerging from a fresh rain. I may be anthropomorphizing a little too much about the grapes growing here in this vineyard, surrounded by the Douglas fir and the cherry orchards to the south here. Does any of that affect scientifically what goes into the grape? Probably not, but it sure comes across in kind of what I taste in the glass.
You're actually sending me back in time, where I've been stood in a single vineyard tasting that vineyard's wine with the winemaker, and I don't know. Yeah, I think you're maybe right to sort of Is it coming really having that influence? But I think if you really kind of then take it to the next level and think about what does that bring, it obviously does affect looking out again at all these trees here. The soil and the conditions in which the grapes are growing would be completely different if all of those trees weren't there. It's having a massive effect on what we're seeing above the ground, but of course and the research still goes on, but all of those other connections that are happening underneath the soil. So I think it's we don't necessarily want the marketers to go crazy on that and to dilute that idea and kind of misquote Mother Nature in a sense. But I'm certain that we are getting a lot of that here, and it's showing up. It's as you say. Yeah, I totally agree about those aromatics that just totally leapt out of the glass. And the texture, the color, everything about this. Again, back to the now sort of 7 or so Pinots that I've tasted. Every single one of them has been totally unique and real, as a sense of place coming through. A real freshness, I would say, and a real, again, vibrancy that's really coming through in a way that I probably haven't had in any of these other wines. So this is right up there. This is gorgeous. Again, a follow-up question comes from your statements there, because I did find it interesting. You were saying around, what is the style and what is the type of wine that we would make here that then turns into 500 cases of production. And I'm just curious. I'm not aware that I've heard it described in quite that way. So I'm just wondering, like why 500 cases, and maybe what is the how does that, maybe that constraint in a way, how does that change this wine year to year, and what are the sorts of conversations that you're having when you go into putting this wine together?
It's I think it's both a business decision and a quality decision. You need to make enough wine that the guests in the tasting room will find it throughout the year, and that my other customers out in the world of distribution can stock it. So it can't be so little that this is a great wine, but it's gone in a month, and I can't afford to care. But on the other hand, you don't want it to be so large quantity that you can't apply the cut. You can't apply the quality decision. That razor that cuts things on this side is a nice wine, clearly, but does not at all speak to this place. And on the other side, it's absolutely nails the taste of the place that we've become familiar with for 25 vintages now. So we're looking for that. As Shannon and I taste through all the barrels, the different clones, the different blocks throughout this vineyard, we're doing that blind. We don't know what barrel it is, what clone it is, what block it is to the very end. We're just taking notes. Our notes are that razor that is making the cut. And then we'll actually assemble the different percentage-wise blends of the things that fell into the basket that said, yes, this is the Raptor Ridge estate. And we'll vary those quantities until we get it just right. If it's less than 500 cases, just fine. It could be 480, 420. If it's 550, which I think this bottling is, this is 510 this year. Mm-hmm. That's fine. I mean, you get the idea. It's a quality decision, but a quantity that can still be economically interesting to the world of wine consumers.
Absolutely fantastic tasting, and I think it again, really speaks to the diversity of what's going on here. And I don't feel need to over-egg this, but I just think, go back and listen again. Those 5 wines, I think, they really demonstrate a lot about what's happening over here. And our reaction and my reaction to those, I think, shows that, this is a region and a producer that's making some really interesting wines that are different price points, different styles. So, I think that really speaks for itself. One of the things that I do want to just ask you to do is, because we've been rightfully very focused on your property and on your wines and on you, it's just to give the listener a slightly wider perspective. And I think the vehicle which I'd like to ask you to do that is Pinot Camp. And I know that you've got a long and distinguished association with Pinot Camp, and not necessarily asking you to do the Pinot Camp history, which I think is probably a podcast in and of itself, but I think just maybe bring out some of the themes that you think are important around the wine scene and the wine community, really, in the Willamette Valley, but through the lens of Pinot Camp, and maybe even looking ahead to the edition that's coming up later this year.
Thank you. Yeah, I love Oregon Pinot Camp. It's something that Annie and I were founding members of back in the year 2000. Its genesis is what you're going to experience in the next few days that you're here. We travel the world preaching the gospel of Oregon Pinot, and we're somewhat successful getting people to understand what we do. But there was a group of producers sitting around one night and saying, man, if we could just get them to come here and see what we go through, how we grow the grapes, produce the wine, the beauty that surrounds us, the richness of farm-to-table fare. Wow, then they'd get it, and bing, the light went on. Let's form Oregon Pinot Camp. It's a group of a little over 50 producers that nominate people in the trade, sommeliers, restaurateurs, wine shop owners, and through a winnowing process, zero in on about 280 people from around the world that we invite to come to Oregon for 3 days. And it's intense. It's from the moment that they wake up until the moment they lay their heads down. It's an intense party, great food, great wine, but intense education about what makes Oregon unique, especially for Pinot Noir, but not just Pinot. I mean, we're showcasing Chardonnays and Rieslings and all that as well. But it really focuses on 3 things: our climate, our soils, and our culture. The climate is very unique. It is affected, as I was telling you earlier, by the Pacific Ocean that moderates us. That crucible, which is the Willamette Valley, nestled between the Cascade Range and the Coast Range, is a perfect kind of a chill growing region, perfect for Pinot Noir. But then you add the soils, and so we take people to the different reaches of the Willamette Valley, and they can see through soil pits that we dig what we mean when we say volcanic soils or sedimentary soils or the Los Laurelwood, and taste the wines right alongside that soil pit. And it's a combination of walking the vineyards with the vineyard managers so they can see the canopy management techniques, the tremendous number of manipulations that we do to the vine every year, touching every vine about 20 times a year. Afternoon tastings in the cellar with the winemakers, many of which are blind, to explore a topic of, terroir or the techniques that we have, and also the culture. I think what comes across is the intense collaboration between now about 800 different wineries in Oregon, represented by these 50 that are forming Oregon Pinot Camp, and sharing information about how to make a quality product, how to get it out there in the world, and compete for our share of glass, if you will. Face it, we make 1.9% of the world's wine, but we make probably a much higher percentage in terms of mind share of people who want quality Pinot Noir. So Pinot Camp pulls all that together in an intense 3 days. And at the end of those 3 days, I think about 10% of the people don't want to go home. They stay here and they try to get a job working for one of the wineries. But we have a rule. You have to go back home and you have to work there for at least 2 years. You're always welcome to come back, but you can only go to Pinot Camp once, in fact. So it's a once-in-a-lifetime experience. So who are these invitees to Pinot Camp each year? How are they qualified? How do they come to be campers? Each year, usually by December, so it's done. The wineries have about 10 names that they can suggest with detailed criteria about each of the people. You want folks that are knowledgeable about wine. They needn't be the complete expert, but they're certainly on the wine route. They're influential in what gets poured in the glass, let's say in either a restaurant or at the wine shop. If not downright the purchase decision maker, they're influential. And they're also on a trajectory with their career, with their time, as I like to call it, on the wine route. They're on a trajectory of they're going to be a mover and shaker. So it's not necessarily the person who's already at the top of their game. You see, it could be somebody who is just a brilliant star and has only been in the business a couple of years, but that winery has identified the person as someone who needs to become an acolyte of Oregon Pinot Noir. And so those names from all the wineries are brought together, merged and purged into a spreadsheet in case we're all nominating that same person from the UK. We only need to invite them once. And then discuss to get to the list of invitees. And we always invite more than we have slots for, because people will say yes, and then the husband gets a job and they have to move, or the wife gets pregnant, or they change roles for whatever the reason. They can't come that year. So it winnows down to around 280 people each season that come to OPC, as we call it. And it's usually held coincident with summer solstice. So you're coming when you can see that daylight hours, the sun out, and until really like 10:30 at night, when the sun is going down behind the hills. And so it's fun to be out in the vineyards, but it also makes the point we get a lot of sunshine during the growing season, and that sunshine is what translates into wine.
Thank you so much, Scott. Really one of those episodes that makes me glad that I recorded it, as you managed to pack in so much detailed information. I'm sure it will demand repeat listenings. Do see below for the Raptor Ridge website. And below that, as you can see, Raptor Ridge are seeking representation in the UK. and the wines are not currently available here. If you're loving the series so far, do please help to spread the word to somebody who needs to hear this. Just send them to interpretingwine.com/listen, where they can subscribe. Next time on the podcast, continuing my journey in the Willamette Valley, in episode 383, I head to Andrew Beckham, owner and winemaker of Beckham Estate Vineyards. And if you're not already, do please follow along with me on social media, where I'm at Interpreting Wine on Instagram and Facebook, at Wine Podcast on Twitter, and email hello@interpretingwine.com. See you next time.